Okay, hello everyone. My name is Kathryn Lampo. I'm a mechanical engineering student at Columbia University, and I'm here today to talk a little bit about my work as a summer scholar at the Robotics Institute at Carnegie Mellon. I worked this summer in the Robotic Exploration Lab under the mentorship of Dr. Zach Manchester, and the title of my project is Next Generation Wildlife Tracking for Conservation. So diving right in, I wanted to give a bit of background, some impetus for the project that I worked on. Our project is focused on developing a new system for global wildlife tracking, which is really important to the study of movement ecology, which is essentially just the study of migrations. And we care a lot about migration patterns, especially in recent decades, because they can give us good clues into the impacts of global warming and the impacts of human encroachment on vulnerable animal populations. So it's something that scientists have been studying with increased interest. And many tracking systems currently exist to accomplish this type of research, but they require heavy, expensive, short-lived animal tracking tags, like the one that you see in the picture on the right here. And so our goal is to address some of the limitations of modern tracking tags and create a system that's more cost-effective and more accurate over existing options. So to do that, we're proposing a system that uses a constellation of autonomous small satellites called CubeSats and a set of cheap low power transmitter tags. And the whole idea here is that we're inverting standard GPS, which is something that some current architectures already do, but we will be doing that as well because it allows for the offboarding of a lot of resource intensive computation from these animal tracking tags, right? Standard GPS, there's a fleet of satellites, they broadcast signals down to Earth, and then the receivers on Earth, for most of us, that's just our cell phone, take those signals and decode them and determine their own location. We're flipping that so that the tags broadcast a signal, and then the satellites do that resource-intensive computation, and that allows the tags to be much cheaper, much lighter weight, easier to produce, less invasive for the animals. My contribution to this project, this idea this summer, was focused on some field testing that we performed in early May as kind of a proof of concept for the idea behind our system. And you can see the experimental setup here. This is important. This is, I'll be talking about some of the data processing and results that came out of this. And so this is the system that we're looking at. Those green pins that you see there are receivers. So those are simulating our cube satellites. The blue pin in the middle is a broadcasting beacon that emits a signal. We use that to allow for time synchronization between the receivers. I'll talk more about that later. And then the red and yellow dots that you see everywhere simulate our broadcasting tag. Yellow is our ground truth GPS data, and red are our location predictions. So to get from that raw RF data, raw radio frequency data that the receivers collect to, those pretty locations that you see on screen there, like I said, there's a lot of processing. And that processing begins with correlation. So both the tag and the beacon broadcast 1023-bit gold codes. These are pseudo-random number codes that are often used in GPS applications because of their really low bounded cross-correlation between sets, which allows a lot of them to be broadcast at the same frequency or in the same frequency range without interference. So we take those gold codes and we cross-correlate, which just means take the dot product between those codes and every 1023-bit section of the raw RF data that our receivers process. And as you can see in the graph here on the right, that correlation value will spike when the two codes or when the two segments align, right? And that lets us know that the signal has been received by the receiver. The cutout that you're seeing on the graph there is kind of just a demonstration that each of these little spikes is actually a small set of spikes because the codes will line up pretty well for a small section of time, a couple of peaks. And so we use a curve fitting method to kind of determine the maximum there and save those off as the time of arrival of these signals at each of our receivers. Then once we do that, we need to do that time offset determination that I was talking about earlier, which is accomplished using the beacon. We know the location of the beacon sitting in the center of our testing setup, and we can use that location to figure out these offsets. So each of the receivers has a really accurate clock, a GPS conditioned clock that tracks the passage of time really well. But we have issues because the absolute time of each of those clocks can be off by as much or as much as a second. And that's a problem in our system, particularly because we're trying to use time of flight calculations to measure distances on the scale of maybe a kilometer with signals that are traveling at the speed of light. So to have accuracy to, a meter scale, we need time accuracy that's 10 to the negative 8 seconds. And so we need these times to be really, really precise. The equation that you're seeing on screen there is just that simple time of flight calculation. TR is the time of arrival at the receiver. Those are the peaks that we just pulled. TB is the time that the beacon emits the signal. The next term there is the actual time of flight. That's the distance between the beacon and the receiver over the speed of light. And then Z, some sort of offset. And so we solve that equation for each of the receivers. It outputs those offsets that you see in the graph on the right. And then we apply those offsets to the time of arrival of the tag signals so that all of those are aligned. Once we align all our tagged signals, there's a little bit more processing that happens. We have to kind of group those and ensure that each set of tag signals, right, we have one from each receiver, represents the same tag pulse. But once we do that, we can finally do our location determination. And this is done by minimizing another version of that same time of flight calculation. So the equation that you're seeing on screen here, our unknowns are Y3, which is the broadcast time of the tag, Y1 and Y2, which are the position of the tag, and then otherwise this is the same thing, right? Broadcast time of the tag plus time of flight minus the time of arrival. So in theory, this equation should be 0, which is why we can minimize it. We use a nonlinear least squares solving method that's a hybrid between the gradient descent and Gauss-Newton methods to solve this across all 4 receivers, and that gives us our desired location outputs. So taking a look at those results a little bit closer, this scatter plot displays the ground truth. That's the black line in the middle. That's our GPS data for the tag. The green dots are our predictions for the locations of the tag over time. And then the gray lines that you see on the outside are 2 standard deviations on the residual set. So you can see that most of the data falls within those 2 standard deviation bounds, which is great. The standard deviation here is about 22 meters. So again, on about a kilometer squared scale, that's acceptable offsets or acceptable residuals. And we knew that there would be some variation in our data set just because of the inaccuracy of some of our measuring, right? Measuring that ground truth with GPS, of course, isn't perfect. Locating the beacons, of course, isn't perfect. And so this is expected error in our data set. You'll see along the y-axis there that this is just a simple distance from the local origin. We have an arbitrary local origin, and here we're just tracking, well, how far away is the tag from that origin? But we can also look at this in terms of X and Y coordinates. So this is a histogram that displays residuals in both the X direction and the Y direction. And you'll notice that the standard deviation in the Y direction is quite a bit higher than the standard deviation in the X direction. This could be due to a couple of things. During experimentation, the tag flew rather close to a couple of our receivers, which created some noise in our data that we couldn't really account for and couldn't really pull accurate location values out of. The experimental setup also is much wider in the X direction than it is in the Y direction. So the receivers are more spaced out in the X direction, which allows for better precision in that dimension than in the Y dimension. Which is something that we're exploring in the scaled up system as well, right? The placement of receivers is really important to the accuracy of the data that we can collect. And so that's something that we're considering when we're looking at the space-based system. So looking forward, these are the results that we were hoping for in this kind of proof of concept simulation that we're doing here. We know that our time of arrival calculations are working well. We're looking at acceptable error in those location residuals. In the future, we're also looking to do full 3D positioning. You may have noticed that I only talked about positions in the X and Y direction. We, of course, also care about altitude in this case. But because all the receivers were placed in a planar manner, we couldn't really determine altitude with much accuracy. So in the future, we will be mounting a receiver to a drone and flying it above the current constellation, the current experimental setup, to allow for that altitude positioning. And then we'll also continue to develop some of those data processing methods that I was talking about. Some of those are rather computationally expensive, computationally intensive. And so when looking to implement this on a global scale with multiple tracking tags, that is something that we will have to continue to work on as well. Thank you.